Hello, church. There is a lot of good news in Christianity, and a lot of it is worth celebrating. Much of what we believe we even call gospel or good news. It's good news that we are forgiven, loved unconditionally, and are looking forward to an eternity spent in heaven with God. And it's good news that we can turn to God in prayer with all of our pains, worries, or troubles. But there are also parts of the gospel that, at least on first glance, don't always sound like good news. For example, loving our enemies and turning the other cheek isn't always pleasant. And the parts about narrow roads and eyes of needles make us uncomfortable. There are parts of the gospel that we struggle with reconciling as good news. And today's reading is one of those passages. The word of the Lord from Mark chapter 8, verses 31 through 38. Then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with the disciples and said to them, "If anyone wants to become my follower, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." Christians are pretty good at accepting the necessity of the sacrifice of the cross. And perhaps that's just proof that we've grown numb to the horror of the crucifixion. Or perhaps we can just see really easily past the cross to the extraordinary depth of God's love that drove Jesus to the cross. Regardless, we seem pretty okay with sacrifice when it's Jesus or someone else. And we seem pretty okay calling that sacrifice good news. But objectively, let's take a brief moment to acknowledge with Peter that crucifixion and sacrifice aren't the poster children of good news. If your loved one or your close friend started talking about the forthcoming public execution that they were facing, I don't think you'd be going around telling everyone the good news. The sad or devastating or life-changing news, sure, but not the good news. And if your loved one also told you that you were next, that you too would have to carry the burden of sacrifice, rejection, and suffering, well, I just don't see us all celebrating that news as good news. It's no wonder that Peter rebuked Jesus. Each of us would have done the same thing. Now, maybe the word rebuke seems harsh to you, but if your best friend said what Jesus said, you might at least tell them not to talk like that. And that makes sense. We naturally don't consider suffering to be good news. We tend to avoid harm and pain and suffering, ill will or trouble or all those things. And we tend not to wish it on others. We sympathize with those who are hurting or sick or are going through hard times. But we certainly don't go door to door telling strangers about how awesome it is that our loved ones are hurting. That'd just be absurd. So it's hard for us to reconcile this teaching of Jesus with the idea of good news. But if we're going to call the teachings of Jesus gospel, and if we're going to call the 4 books of the Bible that have the stories about Jesus gospels or good news, then we need to figure this out. I think there's several ways we can do this. The first, and perhaps the way that you're most familiar with, is to remember that the story doesn't end at the cross. Yes, Jesus was rejected, mocked, tortured, and unjustly executed. But it didn't stick. He was resurrected and now he reigns over all of creation for all of eternity. So we can rationalize his suffering in the context of his glory. Colloquially, we say pain lasts a minute, but glory is forever. And that's true, and that works. It does run the risk of trivializing the real and painful moment of suffering. Our instinct is to get through the crucifixion as fast as possible to the resurrection on the other side. And sometimes if we do that too quickly, we run the risk of almost avoiding the crucifixion altogether. Now, another way to rationalize suffering as good news is to justify it. So yes, Jesus suffered immensely, but he chose that suffering for the good of others. We tend to save this kind of talk for anyone in the category of martyr. Soldiers, first responders, heroes who risked their lives for others. And this is perhaps the easiest way to find good news in suffering, to assign positive meaning to something so horrendous. But what Jesus calls us to in this passage is different still. He doesn't just tell us that he will die for our benefit. He calls us to follow him into his suffering, and to take on the mantle of rejection and sacrifice also. He is setting an example of sacrifice, and that is what makes this passage so hard. We've come to terms with why Jesus suffered and died. But if that was for our benefit, then why do we have to suffer and sacrifice too? Well, according to Jesus, the only way we truly find and save our life is by losing it, which is one of the most confusing things Jesus ever taught. But I think the trick to understanding what he means is in his call to follow. As Christians, we are disciples, followers who imitate the example of Jesus. So we follow. We follow the teachings of Jesus, and we follow his compassion, and we follow his sacrifice. And yes, that means that we sacrifice for one another because Jesus did. And yes, that means that we might be rejected, ridiculed, or suffer like Jesus did. All because the path of Jesus can only ever and always lead anyone to the cross, both Jesus' own cross and our own. But like Jesus, the suffering that we endure, the rejection that we face, the sacrifices that we make, these are all for the good of others, and not the end of the story. We learn from Jesus how to purpose our trials and our troubles to benefit those around us. And we learn from the example of Jesus how to endure injustice and pain and suffering by holding on to the hope of glory. So just because Jesus suffered and sacrificed, and because we follow his example, we suffer and sacrifice, hoping that our pain can bring good news to others, and confidently knowing that glory awaits us for all of eternity. And that is where we find good news in this passage. And we find it by following. We follow Jesus as he goes to the cross, and we find our own cross there. And it may not be what we want, but there's still good news to be had. Maybe for those around you, or maybe the good news is awaiting for us in heaven with God, or somewhere in between. But if we have the eyes to see, we can find gospel in our suffering. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May God make God's face to shine upon you and give you peace.